Welcome to the Brute Facts Podcast with your host and everybody's favorite Christian, Eddie Kroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell for future content.
Welcome to Brute Facts. I have one of the biggest guests that I've ever had on here, Dr. Graham Oppy. I am trying as hard as I can to not fanboy, although I'm a theist and he isn't. He is one of my favorite philosophers, and I was absolutely humbled and stoked when I asked him to come on to the show, and he agreed with no issue whatsoever. So let's bring Dr. Oppy on and find out a little bit about him. How are you doing, Dr. Oppy?
Very well. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it that you come on to a show this small. One day I'll be big and famous, and you'll be glad that you did. So, how's it going there in Melbourne? Is that where you're at?
Yeah. So yes, it's a very nice day today. So we're kind of just about to head into winter, but it's blue skies and sunshine. It'll be, I don't know how to do the conversion of the temperatures. It's about 16 degrees Celsius. So
yeah, that's
quite pleasant.
It seems like no matter how long I mess around with math or at what level, I can't ever get the Fahrenheit to Celsius right. It just it seems almost impossible to work out sometimes. So you are, for those that don't know, PhD philosopher. You're a professor, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know you've written many of articles, books. On, I think your dissertation was philosophy of language.
Yeah, that's right. So the topic there's a little bit esoteric, so maybe we can kind of skip over the details about exactly what it was about. And PhDs are often like that.
Yeah. Well, I just recently started getting into philosophy of language because, so many times when we have debates and things and people, we're just arguing semantics. It's like, well, that's what we need to be talking about. We need to know exactly what you mean by what you mean. So growing up, what do you consider yourself, just agnostic, or what kind of position do you hold?
Okay, so I'm an atheist. So I don't think that there are any gods. So in particular, I don't think that there's a single God. And so that puts me at odds with most of the religious traditions around the world. So that's how I would I guess the way that I would describe myself would be to say that I'm a naturalist. So roughly, I think that the causal stuff is just exhausted by the universe, or if there's kind of many universes, the kind of space in which all the universes fit. But it's much easier to kind of describe the view if we think, well, there's just our universe. That's where all the causal stuff is.
Right. So did you grow up religious or?
Yes. So my background has quite a lot of religion in it. So I'm thinking about my parents, my grandparents, and so on. So on both sides of the family, the tradition is Methodist. So it's, I guess, UK Methodist. So my ancestors came from the UK to Australia and brought their Methodism with them. My grandmother on my father's side was very active in the Bible Society throughout her life. She lived to be 90, and she was still an active member of the Bible Society when she was 90. At one point, my father sort of considered becoming a preacher, but he ended up deciding to go with engineering instead. It's sort of interesting. So my mother so they met through church. My father went to Sydney to do a master's and happened to go to start attending the same church that my mother was at. My mother's religious beliefs kind of stayed fixed right through her life, so she was still a believer when she died. My father, it was a bit less clear. There were various things that happened in the last part of his life that, to me anyway, I kind of suspect that he was much more agnostic by the time that he died. But that's long after I'd become an atheist. So the next part of the story. So I grew up in a sort of pretty, by Australian Methodist standards, it was sort of conventionally religious household.
Okay. Well, yeah.
So I couldn't explain what that meant. We went to church on Sundays. I went to Sunday school before I went to church. We said grace before meals. We said prayers at night. It's not huge. It's not a kind of huge commitment the way it might be in some branches of the Christian faith, but it was, reasonable. And that I did that until I was 12 or 13. And then over a very short period of time, I just decided I didn't believe it. And that was kind of the end of my connections with the church, really. I continued to go to church occasionally with my parents for special events. That lasted until I was 18 or something. And then I just stopped. Now it's weddings.
I'm done.
Weddings and funerals.
Yeah. I'm tired of messing with it. Well, at least it was Methodist and not something, far more conservative and legalistic. And I'm not sure, about Methodists in the UK, but here they're pretty reasonable and, not legalistic, literalist that, you're going to hell and you need to believe and all these things. So that's pretty, that's better than what it could have been. So did you, so you, at a young age, you decided that you didn't believe anymore.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to remember the detailed process. So I sort of started wondering about, and I don't know why I started. And a few weeks later, I wasn't wondering anymore. I just stopped believing. And it's not because I talked to people. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I've got no idea what the thought processes were, but at the end of it, I was just an atheist. So
yeah, that's a point. That's actually something I'd like to come back to, is your thoughts on beliefs in general. So what led you to want to do philosophy of religion? Were you just still intrigued by the fact that so many people still believed, or so many stories and religions? What was the motivation there?
So I've told this story before. It was kind of accidental. You mentioned that I did philosophy of language as my PhD, and I didn't really study much philosophy of religion, but I came back to Australia without a job, and I and my wife had a job in Canberra, so I went back to Canberra with her, and then the ANU the Australian National University needed someone to teach philosophy of religion, and they asked me could I do it. So I thought, yep, I can do that. And so then I taught myself philosophy of religion while I was teaching it to the students. It's just 1 week ahead of the class. That's enough. All the way through the semester, and by the end of it, I knew a bit about philosophy of religion, enough that I published a couple of papers, as you kind of do. Yeah. And then I got a sort of contract job for a while, and I was teaching other things, a bit of history of philosophy, a bit of logic. And I had this opportunity to apply for a grant. And so I thought, I'll apply for a grant to do some research on Reformed epistemology. I didn't even really know what it was, but I thought, I'm not going to waste lots of time with this application. So I just wrote out the application, and I got a 3-year postdoc out of it. And in order to fulfill the obligations of the postdoc, I actually had to write a book. So that was where the book on ontological arguments came from. And by the time I'd written that book, I was kind of settled down this path of doing philosophy of religion. So it wasn't really that I chose it; I just fell into it. Really.
Yeah, that's kind of how philosophy of religion is. It kind of chooses you. It's its own kind of theistic thing. My background is mechanical, and if you would have said, 20 years ago that I'd be immersed in philosophy, period, much less philosophy of religion, I would have been like, that's why would I get into something where people just think and then argue over thinking? But the more that I learned, the more I was intrigued, and it just kind of here, 15 years later, I'm a total layperson. I've spent a lot of time in it conversing with higher level philosophers and things of that nature. So, by no means any kind of expert. So, but it's all self taught, and it's just something that ended up becoming a passion for me.
Right. As you go on, you find more reasons to keep doing what you're doing. So there are other stories that I could tell about the way that my career's gone on and why I've kept doing certain kinds of things. But that was the kind of origins story, how I got into it.
Yeah, that's yeah. You just kind of fell into it. I'm not sure if you know Tom Jump or not, but I had Tom on and had interviewed him, and I asked him about philosophy. What he said philosophy's terrible. He said I just got into it, just arguing and got into it, and now it's just something to make money. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, I guess that's a good reason if there's any. But so you've done so many things in philosophy. I mean, you're kind of like the jack of all trades. And I didn't even know you had done anything with Reformed epistemology. I was actually just talking with some guys in a group earlier about Reformed epistemology because I started out as a Reformed epistemologist and since have moved away from it. Did you do a whole lot of work on it, or was it just something that?
So what happened was that I started by reading Plantinger's 1974 books, so The Nature of Necessity and God, Freedom and Evil, and thought I'll start by writing something about ontological arguments. And so I started researching ontological arguments a little bit. And I started writing some stuff, and I realized after a while that I was going to have enough material for a book. And so that's all that I got done, right? My research in that project didn't get beyond researching ontological arguments. So I didn't really end up doing much research at all on Reformed epistemology.
I don't blame you. I spent quite a while in it, and when I would defend Reformed epistemology, and we would have these discussions and these Facebook groups and things, and they're and I'm kind of laying it out, and I'm like, you do realize that this is something that was developed over many years, many volumes. There's no way I can put all this out there, for you to understand it, because on the surface it seems, and then there are some issues with it, but on the surface it seems like there's easier, worse problems than really what there is. So it was kind of just where I fell into, and the ontological argument in ontology is actually what got me into philosophy. Period. I had heard R.C. Sproul, which I didn't know at the time was, Reformed and more or less a presuppositionalist, but he had talked about, and it was the first time I'd ever heard anything about, an ontological argument. I couldn't wrap my head around what it was, and I was like, that's too easy. There's got to be something, that's that's there, and that's kind of where, of course, I don't think it's a convincing argument, but that's kind of what hooked me into it. So
yeah, so I got really interested in the ontological argument, or in ontological arguments, because one of the things I decided was that there's lots and lots of them, and they all required different things to be said about them, and that was how I ended up with the book. Yeah, it's remains a topic of interest to me. I don't think that. I mean, maybe this is just kind of characteristic of philosophy, that the final word never gets said about anything. But there's still lots and lots of interesting stuff being written about ontological arguments.
Yeah, that's what surprised me. I had, of course, you've been on Joe's show quite a bit, and when he come on, he wanted to talk about and the ontological argument or an ontological argument, and I see exactly why now. I spends a lot of time with you, so it's just to me it's an interesting subject. I mean, just ontology, in general. I love metaphysics. I love, ontology. It's the things that the hardest to wrap your head around seem to be the kind of things that draw certain people in, and I'm one of those people. So are you doing any work now on it, or are you still just, is it just kind of a few papers here and there, or talking about it here and there?
So I haven't done any new work on it for a while. I've been busy thinking about other things. I mean, I sometimes wonder whether I should go back and kind of do a sort of revised version of the book on ontological arguments and kind of update it, because it was written in the early 90s and there's a lot that's happened in the discussion of the arguments since then. But I don't know, that maybe.
Yeah, it's one of those things you'll get drawn into. Maybe there'll be a grant there somewhere for you, or a task or something that you can fulfill there. So not to totally just flip upside down, but I had mentioned earlier about when we were talking about beliefs and this, that, and the other. So what is your philosophical position on belief forming? Do you have any particular type of epistemology for how we come to have the beliefs that we have, or justified, or?
Okay, so I guess I'm broadly sympathetic to the kind of picture that Thomas Reid had. There are various sources that are kind of legitimate sources for our beliefs. So obviously perception and introspection are two of them. But and perhaps you might think of the other things as being slightly derivative from those, but testimony, which, right, hearing what people say, is one of the biggest sources of beliefs. And we tend to believe what people tell us. I mean, of course, that's a very broad rule of thumb. We're actually quite careful in figuring out who we can trust, who are the reliable sources of information. But when we've got those people and they're talking about things that we think they know a lot about, we tend to just believe what they say. So testimony is very important. Memory, and then there's also inference. On once you've got some beliefs, you can infer other beliefs from them. So there's a diversity of sources for belief that any sensible person is going to make use of. It's very hard for just think about how hard it would be to have a sort of satisfactory set of beliefs if you never relied on what anyone else told you and you insisted on working everything out for yourself. You would know next to nothing about anything if that was your approach.
Yeah, you would be Descartes all over again, trying to put things back together. So,
well, except that I'm thinking here you're trying to assemble them for the first time. So,
oh yeah, you're right.
And then, I mean, if you think about how long it's taken us to get to where we are with maths and physics and chemistry and things like that, if you had to do it on your own, you wouldn't get anywhere.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. When I get questioned about, the testimony, being a Christian, you seem to get camps that you have, a lot of theists that will accept just about any testimony. And then you have the other side who thinks that testimony is absolutely worthless. And it's like, you do realize that pretty much everything we believe, and that has a scientific and academic consensus or something like that is because of testimony. These people have credentials and we tend to trust them. So yeah, I totally agree um, with that idea. Do you think that? So I kind of take the stance that when I get asked, do we choose our beliefs, or is it totally a internal deterministic kind of thing? Intuitively, to me, beliefs can be something we choose. Some we just kind of find ourselves with the belief.
So I think I mean, it's sort of difficult if you think about something that you don't believe and say, okay, let me believe it. It kind of doesn't work. You can't choose your beliefs like that. But there's all kinds of ways that you can shape your beliefs. So you might think, oh, gee, I wish I had a lot of beliefs about quantum mechanics. So you can go away and study it, and that way you'll acquire the beliefs, right? So,
Yeah.
things like what you pay attention to and what you decide to sort of invest effort in makes a difference to what you end up believing. And in that way, kind of the will enters into believing in a significant way.
Yeah, I'd totally agree with that. Um, so didn't want to spend too much time on that. I was just kind of wondering what, how your position on it was. So, I do have to say, one of the all-star moments in any debate or discussion that I have seen was with you and Loke. And Loke laid out, well, I think, 16 premises for his argument. And I think it was 2 pages, 3 pages long, and in the most gentleman way possible. Uh, it was more or less the way that you responded was, you're going to have, you got to support. I'm going to deny premise. You're going to have to support that premise with another argument. Or I'm going to deny that. And then it was like, just in the most gentleman way possible, it's like, hey, let's cut the BS. Where is the issue? Let's talk about that. And it was like one of my favorite moments that I've seen, because even being, a lay philosopher and loving philosophy, I like things to be hashed out. But when you've beat a dead horse so much, and then somebody lays out a 3-page argument, it was so refreshing, the way that you kind of and see where we disagree. So it was definitely one of my favorite parts.
So I guess that has to do with my attitude here. Like, I think you kind of know, if you've got a theist and an atheist talking to each other, they're going to disagree about lots of things. But what they really need to do is to kind of come to understand the other person's point of view by finding out what they believe and how they think the various things hang together. So what are the kind of more fundamental things that they believe that support everything else? Before you turn to trying to make the other person change their mind and agree with you, that's sort of way down the list of
Right.
on the to-do list, things that you want to do. And in fact, you might well be, as I tend to be, not really that interested in trying to encourage people to change their views, right? I think there's kind of there's this prior stuff about understanding that's much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree totally. And that's, a lot of times, because I'm in philosophy of religion, and I'm a theist, a lot of times, people will bring up apologetics or say apologist or something like that. And I make it extremely clear, I'm not an apologist. Apologetics it's theological. I'm not here to defend the faith or change people. I don't do the evangelism that a lot of people do. I like to talk about what I believe, why I believe it, in the setting with other people who either do or don't believe like me, and because I don't want to hold to irrational positions or non-logical positions. And I think, just like you said, a lot of people go into those, and their whole motivation is to win a debate, win an argument, or try to change somebody's mind. And I think there's far more value if we can say, okay, I truly believe this, and I think that this is a very good, solid, sound argument, and this is why. And then the other person's, tells them, well, these are the issues that I see. So that's why I love the discussions instead of the debates. And when people don't try to convert other people or deconvert, it's definitely far more beneficial.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of discussion, and not much for one for debate. I mean, to go back to your initial example, if someone starts out with an argument that's got 16 premises, it's going to be very hard to have a discussion about that, unless you just go, okay, so let's start at the top. Let's take the first thing and let's talk about that for perhaps a very long time.
Yeah, I like Andrew. And when he started talking about his own version, I grabbed my pen and pad because I'm real ADD. So if I don't write stuff down, it's hard for me to remember. So I grabbed my pen and pad and I was like, okay, let's see what he's got. And he just kept going and going. And I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to sit here like this. I couldn't believe how much of an how much it was that he brought. But
so, I mean, to be fair, there's a book that he's written, and you can go and look in the book, and you can sit down and you can sort of make an overview of the entire argument. But it's difficult to bring that to a chat.
Yes, absolutely. But I thought it was still a pretty good informative discussion. It was little accent language barrier, kind of hard for me to follow sometimes, and excitability on his side. But I'm definitely more for the discussions and the whole book thing. I have a problem with books. And that is, I can't stop buying books when I don't finish books. I go buy other ones and then leave them half finished or something. So I have this whole stack of books that I've read like parts of or skimmed or chapters or so.
That's okay. That will be true of every professional philosopher, right? And sometimes that will be kind of deliberate because you look up the index and you find the bit that you're interested in. But it's also the case, you start reading books and they're very big, and after a while you think, I'm not getting much out of this. I'm just going to give up.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking, it's like, because there's another one, somebody else writes a book and I'm like, oh gosh, I got to get that. That's going to be great. And then I have this wish list on Amazon. It's like this long, and other people are like, hey, have you checked out my book? And then I feel compelled to have to get their book, and I have this whole list of books already. So it's definitely not something I ever anticipated, for sure.
So you can't see it because it's over there, but that side of the room is just lined with books. There's 1,000 books or something sitting there. I haven't read half of them because life's too short. You just can't. Yeah. But I keep it, just like you. I keep acquiring them, and then there's more behind me as well. So.
It's almost like an obsession or something. It's as long as I have the book, I know I can go to it later or look at the chapter or something like that when I want it. So it's definitely, my wife for a while was like, you got another book? You got another book? And some, and of course, I mean, some of the books are expensive. But you feel like you need it at the time when you're going through a certain subject. So do you have so what would be your favorite argument, or what do you think is the strongest argument against theism? Would you take maybe I've heard you talk about the problem of evil time to time, or would you say that was probably the...
So I think that really the strongest kind of argument is almost certainly going to be some kind of cumulative argument where you put together a whole lot of different considerations and argue that collectively they support your view over some competing view. So to take a theist example, I think that Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, where he sets out this Bayesian argument, so he starts off with sort of prior probability, and then he considers, I don't know, it's about a dozen different bits of evidence that he thinks provide strong support for the existence of God. That argument is going to be stronger than any argument that just considers one of the bits of evidence and tries to make the case. And so on the other side, I'll give a little plug for one of my books, the book, The Best Argument Against God. I do the same kind of thing, except not in the Bayesian framework. I say, there's these two, we'll compare theism and naturalism. There's a kind of question about which one's simpler. And then there's all this evidence, lots and lots of stuff. Why is there something rather than nothing, fine-tuning, evil, lots and lots of stuff. And then just weigh the two views up. What I think happens if you do that is that you're not going to get a persuasive argument, but you will help people to understand why you believe as you do, because they can see what you think about all the different bits of evidence that seem to be relevant and why you think that your view is at least competitive on all the bits of evidence. And I don't think that you're going to get a stronger argument than that kind of argument.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And that's actually one of the points that, I make a lot when people ask me, why are you a theist or why are you a Christian? If I wasn't a Christian, I would still probably be a deist or something like that, because to me, when you take the set of cosmological arguments, and an abductive reasoning, it just seems to build a case that there's some necessary foundation to, reality. And of course we can, you go on into a God, a personal God and things like that. But I just find them convincing. And it's funny because lately it seems like everybody's talking about the Kalam. And, my understanding is the Kalam was not even meant or intended to get to God. It was basically like part of the abductive process for having a first cause. And so I don't think when we take these arguments in isolation, none of them are powerful alone. I think you have to look at it from an abductive nature.
Right. So unless you have the view that there's a kind of knockdown proof that takes you all the way to God, so you can kind of prove not only that God exists, but God's got all of this long list of attributes, I don't think there's going to be any alternative to what you just said, right? The kind of overall support for the view is just going to be abductive. And then we can say, okay, so you think this is the best explanation for all of this stuff, but is it? What about these alternative views? And so, the deists will be at the table. Lots of other people will be too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, with some of the new atheists that I come across, they, want to focus on all of these things that really don't matter. And I try to tell them, I'm like, look, if you really want some good arguments against God, then you need to focus on, like a set of arguments like divine hiddenness, the problem of evil and suffering, or animal suffering, because when you take all of those arguments and you put them together, they seem to kind of paint a grim picture, at least for there being an all good God or, the omni God. So,
so those kinds of considerations might not count against a kind of indifferent deistic God, one who set the ball rolling and then went on holidays, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. He hooked it all up and bounced out. He said, okay, see y'all later. That's so, on what would you say, given if you were to consider theism again, what would be the most convincing idea of theism to you? Would it be like a deistic kind of uh, intelligent something other? Or
Yeah, so it's hard to say, but I guess that seems closest to where I am, right? If you because it builds the least into the the theistic theory, and given that I'm not a theist, but maybe if I went there, I would find it kind of unsatisfactory, and I'd want to keep going further. I mean, that's really hard to say because it's not it's not a kind of life possibility for me. I don't think that I'm going to do that. But
yeah,
so it is really kind of hard to speculate.
it's you don't believe, but if you did believe, what would you believe? Kind of.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of tricky.
yeah, most definitely. Or maybe some type of ontological something that we can kind of define into existence, or because I don't know how many times I've heard, the ontological arguments defining God into existence. And I'm like, I don't think that's the best objection. But
No, I wouldn't say so either. I wouldn't say that was the best objection.
so who would be, do you have any philosophers that would be like your biggest had a huge influence on you? Or are you a classical philosopher kind of person with the ancient philosophers, or there maybe modern ones?
So, okay, so the biggest philosophical influences on me would have been my teachers. So, um, so I was an undergraduate at Melbourne Uni, and somebody that no one listening to this podcast will have heard of probably, a guy called Alan Hazen, was by far the biggest influence on me when I was an undergraduate, because he was quite happy for me to come and talk to him about stuff outside of class. I spent lots of time talking to him, and I learned kind of metaphysics and modal logic and stuff from him. So he would, in some ways, if you had to pick one person, he would probably have been the single biggest influence. When I went to graduate school, my advisor, Gil Harmon, and another guy who was on my panel, David Lewis, were both enormous influences on me, and you can see the effects of their views and sort of discussions with them in my work. Historically, I haven't ever really been a serious student of ancient philosophy. So, as an undergraduate, I read some Platonic dialogues, and I occasionally read bits of Aristotle, and so on. But I don't have the languages, and I don't, and I've never really seriously studied it. So I wouldn't say that there are kind of influences there. Amongst the moderns, I mean, in some ways, it's a bit the same story. Like, I've read bits and pieces. I've read a fair bit of Hume, and I think Hume's a very interesting character. But there are kind of aspects of his philosophy that I just couldn't possibly accept. So, right, and that's kind of true for the historical figures in general, right? There'll be bits and pieces in them that I like, and then there'll be other stuff in there that I don't. And partly it's just, I think that has to do with their circumstances just being so different from the ones in which we live. There are other people who sort of are much fonder of the history of philosophy as a kind of source for their own current views than I am.
Well, this whole time we've been talking, you have constantly been making me feel better and better, because I'm kind of the same way. I try, I've read, a bit of it about Aristotle and Plato and the ancient philosophers, and it's mostly the newer philosophers or people directly related to, where I've been learning, that's the biggest influence. And it kind of feels almost like a sin that if you're not like this super ancient philosopher buff, or you have to love them, or something like that.
So there's just too much philosophy for anybody to be able to be across all of it. And there are some people who are super impressive, who know a great deal about ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy. That is, say moderns, I mean up until, say, some point in the 19th century. But if you're going to be expert about all that stuff, there's going to be lots of stuff about the last 150 years that you're going to know next to nothing about, because nobody can be across everything. There just has to be specialization.
Well, and that's one of the things that I found kind of just stumbling into philosophy, is it's extremely overwhelming, because there's literally, I mean, you can take, one area of epistemology, and a philosopher will spend his entire academic career working on it. And then you have all these other things, of philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and it's so, and you want to try to get all of it in. You want to learn, because you talk to this guy who's really smart in this area in philosophy, and you're like, man, I need to learn more about that. And then here, and then here. And so I explained it to my wife. I said, because she was totally like blindsided years ago about, just like I was, how I got into philosophy. But one of the analogies I use is, I said, if you take like the safety glass that they put in vehicles now, and you crack it, it comes up with all these millions of cracks, or thousands of cracks. You pick one crack, and that's where a philosopher will spend his entire academic career, and you have all these other cracks still out there. So you can't possibly get to all of them as much as we want to.
And it's worse than that, really, because to do many areas of philosophy, you need to know about other disciplines as well. Like if you want to do philosophy of physics, you better know some physics, right? And if you want to do philosophy of history, you better know some history, and so on. For philosophy of maths, you really better know quite a bit of maths, and so on. And so it's not just trying to get across the philosophy, you also have to get across a bunch of other areas. And this is true in philosophy of religion as much as anywhere else. You need to know, depending what your area of focus is, you need to know some stuff about history, you need to know some stuff about ethics and politics, you need to know some stuff about theology. In fact, this is really one of the things I like about philosophy of religion. It turns out that metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, logic, they're all relevant. So you have to know you have to know a bit about a whole lot of things in order to do it.
Right, absolutely, and that was something, of course, I never foresaw, and and the thing is, it also seems like that when you talk to higher level philosophers, or those that have been in it a lot longer than I have, they seem to have a label and a category for each area that they follow, like a specific epistemology and a specific grounding, a specific ontology, and I'm just like, I'm still trying to work that out. I don't know, exactly where I'd be on, like, philosophy of mind. I'm totally lost right now. I considered myself a substance dualist at one time, and now I'm just like, I don't know, maybe hylomorphism. I don't know where I'm at now. So
if you go to the Phil Papers, Phil People, whatever it's called, the Chalmers
yeah,
where they've got the survey results for the big list of questions. So I've done that survey, and for about 2/3 of the questions, I just put no opinion. Right? It's not like you have to have an opinion about all of those things in order to be a philosopher.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually heard people in certain online debates appeal to surveys like that as evidence for things, and I'm like, I don't think I'd be, putting too much stock in questionnaires in philosophy. It just, it's not something that's going to be, like some type of academic consensus or not.
The data there might be interesting though. So
Yeah.
According to the Phil Papers study, something like 75% of people who work in philosophy of religion are theists, but about 75% of philosophers are atheists. So that's kind of interesting and maybe says something about what the field of philosophy of religion is like these days. It doesn't tell you anything about where the truth lies, though.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to be making any appeals to authority or, it's our academic consensus or something like that. And that's what's funny about philosophy is, and I've actually heard people in online debates use a consensus in philosophy for certain things. And I'm like, whoa, that's not like a scientific consensus or something. So like I've heard people use the stat that most philosophers are atheists, therefore atheism is, more likely or something like that. It was crazy.
Yeah, so there are experts that you can treat a little bit like gurus in physics or maths or things like that, right? Someone's a member of one of the academies. You want to know the answer to a question. If you've got access to them, you can ask them and they'll tell you what the answer is. You can't treat philosophers like that. There are no philosophers who are gurus who just
right.
are reliable sources of the truth about metaphysics and epistemology and logic. And well, logic's slightly different, but metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and so on.
Yeah, I love logic. I love formal logic. It's I'm an analytical kind of guy, not just analytic philosophy, but just analytically. Period. I'm a structured kind of person. So when I discovered, logic and formal logic and symbolic logic, it was just right up my alley. I was like, look, we can take arguments and put it in a math equation. How cool is that? So, but I'm not a huge fan of math either. I must say though, the conversation you had with Craig on the argument for God using mathematics was very interesting and intriguing, and I thoroughly enjoyed that exchange.
Yeah, so I enjoyed that one too. So I've had, living in Australia, I don't get as many chances as I would like to have to talk to people like Bill. But I met him first years ago at a conference, a cosmology conference in Santa Barbara back in the 90s. And so I've had a few chances to chat to him. He's a really good philosopher.
Yeah, I heard he was a very pleasant person to talk with, and kind of like you, he's willing to go on these smaller shows and have, and talk with people on them, and that's, to me, that says a lot about your character and his character. So I told you I would only keep you for an hour. So we've got about 10 minutes left. We do have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind taking a few questions.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. Pasta, you want to take over the question and answer section, or are you going to put them up for me to read? There you go. I guess I put them up. How many philosophy degrees does it take to provide evidence for Jesus actually being his own? Okay. Yeah, that's not even really a good question. How do you respond to Craig's second stage of the Kalam?
So by that, I assume you mean the part of the argument that gets you from the universe has a cause to the cause of the universe is God. I assume that's what the question's arguing about. So in general, there's lots and lots of attention in cosmological arguments that's paid to the first stage, the stage of arguing that there's a cause of the universe, there's a first cause, there's a necessary being or whatever. And much less attention paid okay, so granting that, how do we establish that that's the God of, say, the God of the Gospels, right? And it tends to be the case that the arguments for the second stage are not nearly as well worked out or as strong as the arguments for the first stage. So, I mean, that's not to kind of respond in detail, because to do that in detail response, we need to know exactly what the claims are and what the further assumptions that are going to be made are. But in general, I think there's way more work left to do, way more interesting work left to do on arguments that we've already got, that when it comes to the second stage as opposed to the first.
Yeah, so that would the second stage would be that's where Craig tries to go with a timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause. Is
Yeah.
that so that gets into empirical data. So given modern physics and my understanding of how popular a eternal universe model is becoming, and given the B theory of time and things of that nature, it seems like it's a tall mountain to have to climb.
So there are definitely hard questions to ask about the kind of timeless eternity, and then God switches on time and is in time thereafter. There are definitely hard questions to ask about that. And as you say, you might bring in various kinds of considerations from physics about what physicists have to say about the nature of time that you might take to be relevant in that discussion.
Right. So, I should know he would pop up a good one. As an identity theorist, how do you cash out qualia sense experience? Do you think our qualitative language is deceiving? How can we reduce or identify qualities with the purely quantitative?
So I don't think that you should think of the physical universe as being purely quantitative. So I don't think that there's a kind of reduction of qualities to quantities here. It's just that the physical universe has various kinds of physical properties or qualities, whatever you want to. I mean, maybe I'll use the word properties and we'll save qualities for the properties of experience or something like that. So I think that the right way to think about experiences is to think of them as some kinds of brain processes. So this is a kind of the very old Australian view defended by Jack Smart back in the early 60s. And I think that Jack was onto something. Exactly. So in that case, the identification is straightforward. If you want to know what it's like to see a red patch, assuming that you're functioning properly, all you have to do is go and stand in front of one and look at it. And then there'll be this processing that happens in you. And that processing, it just is you're seeing the red patch, your experiencing of the red patch or whatever. It doesn't seem to me that there's anything particularly problematic about this view, but of course that's highly controversial. There are lots of people who have differing views.
Yeah, this one is above my pay grade, so I'll let your answer stand. So besides the advantage of naturalism, is there other sustaining reasons for Dr. Graham's atheism? What does he think about the best version of evidential arguments from evil and divine hiddenness? I think
So I think that the kind of overarching reason that from my point of view, for favouring naturalism is that naturalism does the best job of kind of balancing out, trying to minimize your commitments, maximize your explanation. I actually think that naturalism is sort of the kind of rock bottom simplest view. So half of the argument's sort of easy to make. right? There's no, I mean, you can not believe in things that naturalists believe in if you want, like try not believing that there's a moon, for example, and reduce your commitments. But there's stuff that's going to be very hard to explain if you think that there isn't a moon, stuff about our experience, right? So I think that that's sufficient. I don't think that if we're thinking about a theistic view, that you need some other reason to reject it. It seems to me that to reject it in order to be able to accept naturalism. It seems to me that that's a kind of sufficient justification for naturalism all on its own. I don't think that there are versions of evidential arguments from evil or arguments from divine hiddenness to which theists simply have no reply, so that their view just gets knocked down. It may be that sometimes when they're giving their replies, they've got to appeal to some new ontology, or they've got to or appeal to some new principles or something like that, which makes their view a little bit more complicated than it otherwise would be. But that's not a decisive strike against the view, because what matters is the kind of overall thing. Once we take everything into account, which is the better view. And as far as I can see, in order to make a judgment coming down on one side or the other in that, you don't have to think that independently there's knockdown objections to the other view. You can just rest content with okay, so on the balance, it seems to me that my view is better, though I can see that other people might disagree with me.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So on that, I have one last question, and it's kind of a follow-up, and that is, what do you mean by natural?
So in one way, I think that actually people are not really in much doubt about what's meant by natural here, especially theists. So think about the kind of theistic picture, so say Christian theists. So God makes a universe, a natural universe that operates according to natural laws. Of course, if you're a Christian, you may think that sometimes God causes or allows things to happen that aren't in accordance with the laws. But suppose we remove that from the picture, what's left is just a natural universe operating according to natural laws. It's a very intuitive idea, and theists all understand what it means. That's just what I mean by natural.
Everything there is without God.
Well, without God and
Right.
the kind of specific things
Right.
like miracles and angels and stuff like that. But yeah, basically. And there's a kind of different way of trying to work towards that, which would be to say, just point to all the stuff around you and say, well, this is all part of the natural universe, right?
Right.
And what I think is that all there is stuff like this, and that's what the natural stuff is. But neither of those is meant to be a definition. They're just meant to show that everybody understands what we mean. And definitions are almost impossible to give in philosophy. There's hardly anything that you can define. If you look at the history of attempts to define knowledge in the last 50 years, it's all over the place, and it doesn't arrive at any kind of agreement. I don't see why natural should be any different, right? Why it would be a problem if, as I suppose, it's actually kind of hard to define natural.
Right.
It's not like it's harder than it is to define knowledge, given the amount of effort that's gone into trying to define knowledge unsuccessfully so far.
Yeah, that's just one of those little cracks in the windshield we were talking about. So it's
right.
When somebody asks me, well, how do you know that, or how do you justify that? I'm like, do you know what you just asked me? It's because it's like it depends on what theory of justification or knowledge that. One of the first books I read in philosophy was a undergrad book on the theory of knowledge, and it was so enlightening and eye-opening to realize that everybody thinks that we just know stuff, and and if you ask them, well, how do you know that? Well, I just know it, and then when you really start thinking about it, you're just like, how do I know that? Do I really know that? So it is definitely intriguing, to say the least. So, did you want to respond to that? Otherwise, I'm going to let you get back to your studies.
Yeah, so no, I don't think I've really got anything to add on that question. I mean, maybe I could add that it's not just knowledge, it's practically every interesting philosophical
Yeah,
term is like this. That often before people come to philosophy, they think if you're going to sort of speak philosophically, you've got to define all your terms first. But that's actually not the case. And sometimes where the use of a word's contested, you might make a stipulative definition. You might say, for these purposes, this is what I mean. So that can happen quite a lot in philosophy of religion with God, because the word God can be interpreted quite differently in different
absolutely.
parts of the Christian tradition, and you might want to be talking about some particular conception in particular. But you when you're doing that, you're not defining the word, you're just stipulating what it's going to mean for certain purposes.
Right. And that's actually something that I've seen when it's almost rare, unless it's a formal debate and it's, professional philosophers, that people actually define the terms that they mean for their arguments. And what's worse than that is when they do that, and then the opposition brings their own definitions. And it's like, wait a minute, if you're going to attack the argument they're laying out, you have to work within the framework of the argument and the definitions that they're using. You can't just come in with your own definition and try to undercut, the argument. So
that's true. I mean, what you should do is work with the definition, but say, I don't think there's anything that satisfies that definition or something like that. I mean, that would be
right.
That would be fine.
Yeah. Steel man. Always steel man your opponent. That's the best way to do it.
Now I agree with that.
Dr. Oppy, I am so humbled and gracious that you have given us your time. Come on here and talked with us and let us learn a little bit more about you. I do look forward to possibly in the future, maybe if time permits. I know you have a very busy schedule, but maybe actually talking about, a specific philosophical area or something like that. But thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you the best in your work and continue making great content.
So thank you for inviting me on. I've enjoyed it a lot. It's been great.
All right. Thank you. And I'm going to see everybody out of here while you hop to the back. Well, there you go. Dr. Graham Oppy. Don't know why he agreed to come on and talk with us, but he did, and I'm happy for it. So he's a brilliant philosopher. I have learned a lot from him, even as a theist. He's very humble in his approach, has a lot of intellectual humility, and absolutely a gentleman. I think he sets a fantastic standard, not just for any atheist philosophers, but all philosophers. So hopefully we can get a lot more people that will interact like he does, and we can all be more Oppy-esque. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, and we will be back next week, I believe, with Dr. Tim Stratton, and we will be talking about Molinism. So that'll be a fantastic show for sure. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a good evening. Be safe.